Hello, hello, hello. This is going to be a quick and dirty explanation of right and left and liberal and conservative. I'm actually going to skip the step of explaining authoritarian feudalism, which with the king, the nobles, and the peasants, with the army in between, because those are back then. Those were the top 10% of all people: the nobles, the landed aristocracy. The craftsmen were like quasi. They're a little bit above the peasants, but with the out of the craftsmen and the landed aristocracy and stuff like that came capitalism. What which is the royalists or the real conservatives, because those are the actual throwbacks. Capitalism and the 19th century beliefs as we have here are actually liberal ideas. The laissez-faire liberalism that we have came out of the late 18th and the 19th century and carried through basically until I do believe it was World War One, which is kind of tamped down a lot of your laissez-faire liberalism and capitalism. So we're going to skip that step. If I have to do something further, I will do something further. But this is like quick and dirty because I don't want this to be a documentary. Okay, at least not yet. But we're going to go through the liberal ideas that came out of the 19th century beliefs. And these are all relatively liberal ideas. And then we're going to take the next step to go into other difference between a liberal and authoritarian. But right now, democracy, modern democracy is a new thing. Modern democracy actually arose with the giving the peasants or the regular folks the right to vote, the right to have a say in government. And that is because what Quigley said: amateur weapons, the gun and gunpowder. With the gun and gunpowder in the hands of the citizen army or the citizen soldiers that could defeat the old-fashioned skilled weapons, you needed bigger and larger armies. You know, uh, bows and arrows and swords cannot defeat 100,000 men with muskets and gunpowder. As Napoleon proved that. So after that, you had to give your citizen soldiers the right to vote, a right to statehood, the right to democracy. Out of the Industrial Revolution came the materialism, faith in science. The universe obeys rational scientific laws. In other words, it's not mysterious or religious. There are no, the belief is there are no gods. There's only science and mathematics and physical laws out there that rule the universe. Your atheism comes up through the faith in science, which is atheism is a liberal idea that that the universe operates independently through cause and effect laws and not some divine credence from the Godhead. Capitalism, which came out of mercantilism, desire for private profit in a price system. Private profit, private ownership, private land ownership, not something that's decreed by the king or the chief. Private individuals can earn not only private land, but have private profits and private enterprise, and that has to be sanctioned by the king. That is a laissez-faire liberal idea. Let them do. And we go down to liberalism itself. These are, all this stuff up here can be congealed down here. Liberalism. These are the tenets of liberalism. Society and the state are bad, so man should be freed. That means the individual over the state. Instead of the collectivism, is a lot of conservatives, the Ayn Rand conservatives think that is a conservative idea. It is not. Collectivism is the natural state of man, is the natural order of man, is the natural order of human beings for most of our existence, to come from the group or the tribe or the clan. And the new idea was that every man is an individual. If you can free the man, some people disagree. Some people disagree that now that the conservatives are kind of waffle a little bit. Now they say that with the constrained view that man is not necessarily good, but that is the reversal of the 19th century idea after World War I. That comes in where the shattering of these liberal ideas actually come in after World War I, and after the war to end all wars, and especially after World War II, where you're going to have to constrain these liberal ideas to keep wars and basically people from killing themselves. But society and the state are bad, so man should be free to do what he wants to do as an individual. That is where the rugged individualist comes from. It's not a conservative idea. It is a liberal idea. Man's economics should be freed from the state. Laissez-faire liberalism, laissez-faire capitalism. The free market, free labor without being taxed or from control of the state. That's also an individualist idea. That's a liberal idea. It's not a conservative idea. That's a liberal idea. Laissez-faire capitalism, let they do. No government in business. In other words, there shouldn't be, the market should determine, basically get your government out of business. There shouldn't be any regulations. There should be free trade. And there should be no tariffs. The market should determine goods and services and prices and what people do and what kind of business you can go in. There should be no regulation. Allow your deregulation that conservatives think is a conservative idea is not a conservative idea. It is a liberal idea. Liberalism comes under liberalism. It is a liberal idea. Under the king and under the state of the king, of the kingship, an authoritarian government, everybody knows that what? The government is going to be in your business. They will determine what you do, and if they don't determine that your business is correct or viable or helpful, they will squash it. You had to get the audience or the permission of the king to do business, or sometimes back then even the church to do business. You had to get a sanction from the church or from the king. Human abilities are innate. Just another individual's idea. Basically, humans are good. What they can do is innate. And they should be afforded the ability and the individualistic idea to express themselves to the fullest. Individuals are the best judge of what's right and wrong. In other words, it's another individual's idea that conservatives think is a conservative idea, but it is a liberal idea. You have what is it? Uh, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty from what? Liberty from the group, liberty from the state, and the pursuit of what makes you happy. And if you do that, what's best for you as an individual is best for society. That is the community of interest. All three of those things are the community of interest. They thought that with the community of interest, if people do what makes them happy, people do what they do best because your abilities are innate. Eventually, you become the best person that you can be. And if all these people come together doing the right thing for themselves, it would coalesce into the best thing for the whole group. That is a liberal idea. It's a liberal idea. The other thing we actually coalesced, actually really coalesced, is actually an idea that started in the 17th, in the 15th and 17th century, which is nationalism. The idea of a state. There used to be kingdoms and areas or groups, and it coalesced into a legal binding defined borders group called a state or a nation state. The nationalist idea. The nation state is a very new idea. We think of it as having always been there, but it is not true. The nation state, and I actually read Kissinger's book about the world order, and he confirmed the nation state basically started in Europe with the Huguenots, and actually developed from there. The Huguenots in the 16th century, I do believe 16th or 17th century, I can't remember which one it was, and developed from there and actually coalesced into the first idea of a state. Even the United States, as we call it, is first was what the 13 colonies, right? And the 13 colonies coalesce into the United States. Statehood is or nationalism. Statehood or nationalism is an idea. Even back then, the individual states or colonies, as we spoke, didn't coalesce into a nation until basically 18th century, and that really didn't get settled until the Civil War with federalism. Federalism is the state, and the Federalist idea actually eventually dominated. So what we see now didn't always exist as far as nation states. Nation states after the United States and then Europe coalesced into nation states, then it spread out and became ideas. The dominant idea that we see now in the 20th century, but is actually a liberal idea. Here it goes back to another 19th century belief that goes along with the community liberalism or the community of interest. Man is born good and free, enslaved by institutions. That's Rousseau. Enslaved by institution. It goes back to liberalism or the community of interest, and should be freed. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Man should be freed from the state and institutions, the innate goodness of man. Liberal idea. We think that is a leftist idea. But if you listen to the left and the right, they believe in the same thing, or what we consider the left and the right. The left and the right in the United States are all liberals. They disagree. And we're going to show that later in another form. Secularism. Now, this is even the modern day Christians are basically quasi-secularist. They're even quasi-secularists. Man in service to himself, free from service to God. Now, even the Christians in America that believe in God in theory, but not in practice. They believe in a higher power in theory, but not in practice. That was the first thing that the United States did in the United States: separation from church and state, secularism. Progress, inevitable and automatic. Basically, in fact, this is something we have to do in the constrained and unconstrained view. And also the trade-off versus solutions. Progress is a straight line. Instead of the constrained view where there's trade-offs, you hit a barrier and you retreat back, which is for most of the time in the history of the world, that was true. Progress was very slow, and it wasn't automatic, and was very painful and trodden until the Industrial Revolution showed that, okay, we smashed through those barriers, and so progress was a lot faster, a lot quicker, and all you had to do was find the solution, and somewhere along the line, with enough minds and enough money and enough effort, you would actually progress. Inevitable and automatic. And both the liberal, what we call the leftists or the liberals, and the conservatives believe the same thing. That is a liberal idea. That meant, it used to be the idea, especially under authoritarian feudalism and religious feudalism, that man was doomed to make the best out of his life and suffer. Suffering was part of a part of his lot. And if he wasn't born lucky or he wasn't born a noble, you stayed in your lane, and that's the best that you can do, and you try to pass it on to your children. And hopefully someday, maybe one day, you get lucky enough to actually get out of it. But progress was not inevitable, and was definitely not automatic. But we have that belief today, especially Americans, that tomorrow is going to be better than today. But that is the first portion of the liberal ideas coming from the 19th century. Next, we're going to get into the modern day 20th century right and left as we see it. Now, this nationalism, which is a 19th century idea and that coalesced into a 20th and 21st century reality. What is nationalism? Political unity with like people. That is nationalism. That is the definition of nationalism. And I did this diagram, it's got to be 5 or 6 years ago. I think it's 5 years ago. 2018, this is a 5-year-old diagram. And I actually did it for one of the chapters in Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope. Nationalism gives you a good view of what is not only right and left, but also relative right and left, or relative conservative and liberal. Okay. Once the feudal or the manorial or the king, what is it called? The royal states or royal kingdoms actually broke apart, became nations. A lot of your culture, your leanings, still held. In other words, just because a system dies doesn't mean that your culture is going to change. And some groups actually, even when they were under feudalism, actually moved toward manorialism and actually moved toward liberalism, close to the liberalism. So even when the the feudal system actually fell, a lot of your culture kind of hung on to that idea of authoritarianism. So even though you're right, your first right and left was capitalism or democracy versus uh, feudalism. Like the authoritarian feudalism was on the right, and your capitalism or your liberalism was on the relative left. Even though I have this reversed, and I probably should have reversed this, but I didn't. I didn't think about it then. This is authoritarianism is basically conservative, or what we consider to be on the right. This is basically the remnants, or the old part of the old way of thinking. Authoritarianism, which is a small group of your overlords, or, for lack of a better term, your strong men, actually imposing themselves on the group, and the group actually following a leader, rather than the democratic and liberal culture that actually is more democratic and more individualistic. So you can actually think authoritarianism is basically the ultimate collectivist, and the democratic liberal, if carried out to its natural conclusion, is the ultimate individualism. And you get a mix of the two. So this is right, this is left. And when you get into and we're going to get into the liberal ideas, or the liberal, what we call right and left. So nowadays we have what we call the neoliberals and the neo-socialists. But in the old days, the conservatives, well, they were both liberals, but in the old days, the capitalist, laissez-faire liberals, and you have what they call the Fabian, the socialist, the Fabian socialist. Capitalism by itself could not exist, or was not a governing system. It was an economic system, and it needed something to balance it. Socialism is actually the balance to this. In other words, you need a middle. This is your middle. This is your left and right. Even today, this is your left and right. Your Fabian socialist, which coming out of, in the United States, really coming out of the Roosevelts, really even before that. Okay, but I'm saying if you think about it, your Teddy Roosevelts, your unions, all that kind of stuff are actually socialist ideas or socialist leaning, coming out of the 1840s and 50s, out of France and out of England. And they're still there today. If you think of half your tenants, your unions, your Social Security, your Medicare, your medical care, and all that kind of stuff, that your taxation, and all that stuff comes out of what? That comes out of the Fabian socialism, the socialist leaning, actually run a society. Your laissez-faire liberals are your capitalists, or your what they call your rugged individualists. And actually, if you go back to the 19th century ideas, you know where these liberal ideas come from. But this whole wing are liberals. So if you look at the liberal authors, or the laissez-faire liberal authors, John Stuart Mill, Descartes, or even Adam Smith, your authors are what? Liberal authors, which is your conservative, or we say conservative capitalist authors. Your liberal countries, the liberal capitalist countries, and this is all relative because they all have some kind of socialist leaning inside of them. But these are your liberal capitalist countries, which is the U.S., France, and Great Britain. These are your Western capitalist liberal countries. You might have, you have others. What I'm saying is we're using these as the ideas or the archetypes for liberal capitalist countries. Your socialist authors, well, obviously Engel and Marx. These are your democratic, non-authoritarian, liberal socialist countries. Your socialism is actually liberal and not authoritarian. Denmark, Sweden, and you could throw in. It's probably at the time I couldn't think of another country, but Denmark, Sweden, France is highly socialist, but it's also highly capitalist. France is like quasi, but you have places like Greece. You got places like Norway, as we think of as another socialist country. Should have put it in. A lot of your Nordic countries are highly socialist. But the thing is that they're liberal socialists. They're not authoritarian socialists. On the other end of the scale, we have authoritarian, or what we call fascist. Fascist and nationalism, or we call authoritarian nationalism. We don't like to think of Otto Bismarck as a fascist or a proto-fascist, but he actually is. Hitler, Mussolini were basically modeled after Otto Bismarck. Very authoritarian, very right-wing authoritarian countries or ideas. And basically, if you look at the fascist countries or the authoritarian countries, are Italy, Germany, and Japan. And so, even though fascism was erased and they became quote unquote democratic, they still carry a highly authoritarian culture. South Korea does. A lot of your African countries do. Haiti does. There's a lot, but the bulk of your countries still have authoritarian leanings. They don't rise to the far right of authoritarian, which is fascism. It's kind of tamped down. But the thing is, the far right carry to its ultimate conclusion will wind up if this basically the corporate authoritarian control of the state, which is fascism, and it coalesced in these three countries in the 20th century in World War II. Now, this is the right wing of authoritarianism. Communism is the left wing. If you look at it, the difference between right and left on this scale, socialism is basically on the left or liberal. Communist is the right wing of socialism, authoritarian. So communism is basically what authoritarian socialism. Fascism is basically authoritarian liberalism. If that makes sense. This diagram is actually, when I actually put it up, is actually very instructive. So communism, authoritarian socialism, Lenin and Stalin, obviously. Marx and Engel are not authoritarian. Even though Marx and Engel came up with the ideas, it was actually not supposed to be, the workers were actually supposed to revolt and actually become a non-state actor. This is supposed to be a non-authoritarian. Socialism was actually supposed to be a non-authoritarian idea. This coalesced into an authoritarian idea under Lenin and Stalin. And like I said, your countries, your communist countries that are socialist, And authoritarian, the top two are what? Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Cuba. We want to think of Venezuela as communist, but Venezuela under Chavez was not. He was socialist. He was democratic. He was socialist. He was elected. Just like Brazil. Brazil is socialist, but they're elected. They're not. They're not authoritarian. They're not. It's not done by force. China and Russia was done by force. The Soviet Union was done by force. North Korea is by force. Vietnam was done under the gun. It was done by force. Under Ho Chi Minh. Same thing with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. It's done by force. That is the difference. So there's a relative right and left. There's a ultimate right and left as far as nationalist states are concerned. And just because say these countries now carry the moniker of democratic, they still have an authoritarian culture. And given their natural leanings, they will go back to being fascist. If you go back to their natural leanings. The Russia and China, even though they have modernized and they have capitalism, and they somewhat have lessened the reins on authoritarian actions, they still are actually a very authoritarian, have very authoritarian culture. Actually, the bulk of the world actually leans this way. Even though they put a democratic moniker on it, the bulk of the world is actually on this side. The bulk of the world is actually leans toward what we call authoritarianism and not democratic and liberal. Democratic and Western and liberal is a very small part of the world. But like I said, this is getting long. I might have to do a longer piece on this. But this is my quick and dirty version of democratic and liberal. In fact, I need to do an addendum to this, and I think I will do the addendum to this right after I close this out. But I'll actually do this later, and my addendum will I'll add this on to the video. There's an addendum I actually probably need to do, but this portion is getting kind of long. So I'm going to end it here on this one, and I'll be back with my addendum a little later. All right, here we go. This is the addendum for my video on conservatism and liberalism. And to begin with, we have evidently two spheres, two halves. We have the liberal left and the conservative right. The liberal left is considered the abandonment of the norm or the conservative ideas as we see it. And the conservative right is supposed to be as it says, the conservation of what we think of as the norm, the normal ideas. We don't realize, in the last video you found out that what they're conserving is 19th century liberal ideas. So on the liberal left, what do we have? We have Fabian socialists. Most people don't know that name. Basically, Fabian socialists are the ones that will actually introduce socialism, or control of the state, control of the people, or introduce socialist ideas to manage folks over time. It comes from the British Fabian Society.
in the I think it's 1860s or 1870s. On the right, we have neoliberals. The Fabian socialists actually took over basically in the 1930s under FDR. And they actually modified a lot of capitalist ideas and introduced a lot of socialist ideas. So I do believe after 1968, when Nixon came in, they brought in a new version of liberalism or capitalism, which is neoliberal thought, which is what we still have today. The vast majority of your policies are neoliberal. We call them conservative. You don't call them liberal because that is a no, that's a bad name. So they call themselves the conservative right, and they call their fellow liberals the Fabian socialists. They don't want to call them socialists because that's also a bad name. They call them liberal, so they actually have invented a new right and left, a new liberal and conservative. And this, the Fabian socialists and the neoliberals actually do what? They form the middle. So we have the centrist, or what people call centrist. The centrists are actually neoliberals and Fabian socialists. That is the middle. So right of center is neoliberal capitalism, neoliberal laissez-faire capitalism, and left of center is actually mild capitalist socialism. The Democrats actually absorbed the Socialist Party back in the 1860s. Actually, we're called Social Democrats. A lot of what the Germans are called now. Germans and the French call themselves Social Democrats. They cut the social off because especially after the Soviet Union took over by force. So now you don't hear the Democrats use socialist or socialism in their talking points at least until Bernie Sanders made his run. Now if you take either of these thoughts to their furthest end, they say on the left, you're going to get communism. Communism is authoritarian socialism. That's what it is. It's socialism by force. It's not socialism by election. It's not socialism by decree. It is socialism by force. Neoliberalism is fascism. It's not capitalism or conservatism by decree or by votes. It's fascist. It's capitalism, corporate capitalism by force of arms. So the military and the capitalist corporate structure is actually enforced by the state. The state, corporations and the military actually run the state. That is fascism. That is the conservative right taken to its extremes. Now, we always hear the middle path that don't go all the way to the Marxist communist ends, represented in things like progressive. When the socialism gets too centrist, like a lot of your leftists, or the old-fashioned leftists went to the middle, right, especially right behind Bill Clinton, they went to the middle, became centrist, and a little bit too capitalist or neoliberal. You came up with the progressives. When the neoliberals went a little bit too left, went a little bit too centrist, now we have what people call themselves libertarian. Libertarians are halfway between, in my estimation, the compromise between the complete alt-right. No, trust and believe the alt-right are fascists. They want this particular conservative state by force. So libertarian is the compromise between the centrist neoliberals and the fascist right. Progressive, or the center part between the centrist Fabian socialists and the authoritarian left, which is communism. Believe it or not, capitalism actually works best in basically what I call the authoritarian right. In the center, things move way too slow. Liberal countries, it's difficult to get things done in a liberal country because it has to be done by consensus, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. And it's even Barack Obama talked about authoritarian countries and how authoritarian countries get things done because your leaders dictate something and it gets done. Somebody dropped a comment in my section. They disagree that China, Germany, Japan, Russia have a authoritarian government or an authoritarian culture. There's a difference between an authoritarian government and an authoritarian culture. Putin is an authoritarian, okay? Xi is an authoritarian. Okay, that is authoritarianism in practice. Thailand has an authoritarian government, and so does Singapore. That is authoritarian in practice. Okay, your culture, like Germany and Japan, has been modified. It's been softened. Korea has been softened. So you have an authoritarian culture, but you don't have an authoritarian government. So there's a difference. But that's how, this is my chart of how we see things. The center, when I say center right and center left, and you hear conservatives talk about center right or center left, this chart is what they mean. Neoliberal and Fabian socialist. The Bushes and Nixon were not neoliberals. They were Fabian socialists. The Bushes have been Fabian socialists for a very long time, going all the way back to Prescott Bush. Even though they carry a Republican moniker, they are Fabian socialists. Reagan's a neoliberal. Actually, Clinton was more neoliberal. Maybe even Bush, Bush Jr. is, I don't know what he was, but I think he was a Fabian socialist, but basically his staff, his administration was most definitely neoliberal. Anytime you have a Goldman Sachs on your board, the neoliberals are there. So when I say look at the policies, and not look at the actor. Because just because they wear a Republican or Democratic badge doesn't mean much. I mean, you can get away with certain things by donning the robes of Republican or Democrat. But at the end of the day, the policies are what you look at. Bill Clinton was supposed to be a bleeding heart liberal, and he was the biggest neoliberal that we've had in quite some time, even more than Reagan. Even though a lot of his policies were hidden. Like I said, Bill Clinton / welfare, Bill Clinton deregulated way more industries in favor of the corporations than the presidents in the past 40 years. He just did. And he got away with it because he was a Democrat and nobody was looking. Obama got away with a lot of things, not a lot of neoliberal policies, because nobody was looking. A Republican could not have implemented TARP. They just couldn't have. But since President Obama, Barack Obama, was a Democrat, he could implement TARP and without too much screaming. A Republican couldn't have done it because they'd have been all over him. If Bush had to try, if Donald Trump had tried to implement TARP, there'd have been all kind of wailing and gnashing of teeth. And it's the policies that you look at. It's the policies that you look at. You don't look at the individual, because, like I said, the policies are consistent from president to president. It's a handoff. Now, Trump is called. You can see the disruption when you don't get a smooth handoff between president to president, because you get a lot of perturbations, a lot of disruption. Now, Trump is trying to undo all the stuff that he was handed off with, and it's causing a big brouhaha by jumping out of treaties, reversing policies that you spent trillions of dollars to get into. You're causing a lot of pain and dislocation by reversing and not following through with what you've been handed off with. Most administrations trust that you will actually, if you're going to change something, you're going to change it slowly, because America is a super tanker, and if you turn it too fast, it'll break. Reversing policies too fast will break the system, and that's like Donald Trump is getting a lot of pushback. He's trying to do a lot of stuff too fast and too soon. So, if you think about it, there's a balance between the Fabian socialist and the neoliberal. Those are two wings of the same bird. Neither can fly without the other. Capitalism cannot fly without socialism, and vice versa. Socialism by itself doesn't work either. There are two wings of the same bird. And a lot of people get upset and do head spins when you pick one side over the other. And the thing is, you can't pick one side over the other, because you can't have one thing without the other. Even from its inception, capitalism rose in the 19th century right alongside socialism. There's a reason for that. The reason that you still have socialist policies inside a capitalist country. There's a reason you still have pro-socialist presidents right next to a staff member that might be neoliberal. Same thing with a so-called neoliberal president in Donald Trump, who's, some people say, borderline fascist, has a lot of Fabian socialists on his staff. You have to have it. You have to have that balance. If you don't, you're headed for disaster. I would love to see a whole court full of nothing but hardline neoliberal, quote unquote, conservatives on the Supreme Court, and in fact full of courts with nothing but neoliberal right-wing policies, and see how America likes it. Because I don't think people understand how this country works and how the balance works. Even Republicans, as harsh as you think they might be, you have a Republican Congress and a Republican president. Really, how much has really changed? Think about it. How much has really changed? Not a whole lot. You haven't seen radical changes, because there's not that much difference between Fabian socialists and neoliberals. A lot of your Republicans are actually Fabian socialists with a Republican moniker on them. They're not as conservative as you think, because they're not really conservatives, as I have shown in this particular podcast. But with that, I'm going to jump over here, try to edit and put this up. But this is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one.